On the morning of January 30th, 2014, a woman named Emi Lebokmeto was looking out across the beach on a tiny island called Tile Islet, part of Ebon Atoll in the Marshall Islands. What she saw stopped her cold. A man was standing near the shoreline, naked except for a few tattered scraps of clothing. His hair matted into something closer to a bush than hair, a beard hanging halfway down his chest, and a knife in his hand. He was yelling, but not in a language anyone on the atoll understood. Emi would later describe the moment simply, "As I'm looking across, I see this white man there. He is yelling. He looks weak and hungry." Ebon Atoll sits near the southern edge of the Marshall Islands, surrounded by thousands of miles of open Pacific. Few outsiders ever reach it deliberately. Arriving there by accident was even harder to imagine. And yet here was a man, alive, screaming in Spanish, next to a battered fiberglass boat that had clearly been at sea for a very long time. His name was José Salvador Alvarenga. When investigators finally learned where he had come from, the claim sounded almost impossible. He said he had drifted more than 6,000 miles across the open Pacific. He said the ordeal had lasted 438 days. And he said that somewhere out there, he had watched the young man who left port with him die. This is the story of a man who survived one of the longest-known ocean drifts in a small open boat, and the serious question that followed him home, whether anyone should believe him at all. Before Alvarenga became known as a castaway, he had already spent years making his living from the Pacific. He was born in the early 1970s in a small town called Garita Palmera, in the Ahuachapan region of El Salvador, where his father ran a flour mill and a small store. He grew up there, had a daughter named Fatima, and by the early 2000s, El Salvador was one of the most violent countries on earth. Somewhere around 2002, Alvarenga left for Mexico. He settled in a fishing village on the Pacific coast of Chiapas, called Costa Azul, and there, he found work fishing for sharks and other large offshore species. The men who fished with him called themselves Los Tiburoneros, the shark hunters, and they worked far out from shore, sometimes 50 to 100 miles into open water, chasing shark, marlin, and sailfish. The other fishermen called him Cirillo. They knew him as fearless, skilled, and sometimes reckless. By the time he vanished, his own family in El Salvador had not heard from him in 8 years. Some of them had already assumed he was gone. On Saturday, November 17, 2012, Alvarenga set out on what was supposed to be a routine trip, roughly 30 hours of deep-sea fishing and back. His usual partner for these trips, a man named Ray Perez, could not make it that day. Rather than lose the run, Alvarenga brought along someone he barely knew, a young man named Ezequiel Córdoba, somewhere between 22 and 24 years old, nicknamed Piñata, known around the village as a defender on the local soccer team. Alvarenga did not even know his surname. Córdoba signed on for $50. The boat was a small, open fiberglass skiff, about 23 feet long, with a single outboard motor and an icebox for the catch. It had no roof, mast, oars, or running lights. They carried drinking water, fuel, sardine bait, hundreds of hooks, several knives, and a two-way radio whose battery was only partly charged. Alvarenga noticed before leaving that the anchor was missing. He went anyway. At first, the trip went exactly as planned. By the time the weather turned, close to 1,100 pounds of fish lay packed in the boat. Then a violent storm rolled in from the north. Over the radio, Alvarenga's voice came through to his boss, a man named Villermino Rodriguez, known to everyone as Willie. Willie, the motor is ruined." Willie told him to drop anchor. Alvarenga told him there wasn't one. His last words over the radio, before it died for good, were simple and desperate. "Come now, I am really getting fucked out here." To keep the boat from capsizing under the weight of the catch, they dumped everything. The fish, the ice, the extra fuel. They rigged a crude sea anchor out of buoys and line. The motor was dead. The electronics were ruined by seawater. In frustration, Alvarenga smashed what was left of the engine and threw the GPS and the radio into the water. From that point on, they had nothing but the current and the wind. A missing persons report went out from Chiapas 2 days after they disappeared. Search planes and boats went looking, but heavy fog and worsening weather shut the search down after only 2 days. No wreckage, no bodies, nothing. As far as anyone on land could tell, 2 fishermen had simply vanished into a storm. What Alvarenga would later describe, in dozens of hours of interviews with journalist Jonathan Franklin, is everything that happened after that. It's important to say clearly that almost none of what follows can be independently verified. There was no one else alive to confirm it. What can be said is that experts in ocean survival, physiology, and Pacific drift patterns have gone through his account in detail and found most of it consistent with what is physically possible. Where that consistency breaks down, we'll get to that too. With no hooks or bait left, Alvarenga went back to a skill from his years as a fisherman. He would press his chest flat against the hull, hold both hands underwater a few inches apart, and wait. When a fish swam between them, he would snap his hands shut. He and Córdoba ate triggerfish, mahi-mahi, the occasional flying fish that landed in the boat on its own, and turtles that came close enough to grab. Seabirds would land on the hull to rest, and the 2 men caught those as well. For water, in the first 2 weeks, they drank their own urine and the blood of the turtles they caught, until the first rain came. After that, they rigged buckets and salvaged bottles to collect rainwater and ration it. Alvarenga would later say he was so hungry at points that he ate his own fingernails. He tracked the passage of time using the phases of the moon, a method his grandfather had taught him as a boy, and by his count, he watched 15 full lunar cycles pass from the deck of that boat. Córdoba did not adapt the way Alvarenga did. At some point, by Alvarenga's later account roughly 4 months into the drift, Córdoba became violently ill after eating one of the seabirds they had caught. From there, his condition deteriorated. He struggled to keep food down and eventually stopped eating almost entirely. Before his death, the 2 men made a pact. Whichever one survived would find the other's mother and explain what had happened. Córdoba also made Alvarenga promise that he would not eat his body. Alvarenga said Córdoba died of starvation. He said he kept the body in the boat for 6 days, sometimes speaking to him as though he were still alive. Eventually, afraid that he was losing his grip on reality, he removed Córdoba's clothing and lowered the body into the sea. What followed, in Alvarenga's account, was the lowest point of the entire ordeal. He described several days where he considered ending his own life, at one point reportedly leaning toward the sharks circling the boat. He said what stopped him was a memory of his mother telling him, as a boy, that people who take their own lives never reach heaven. Alvarenga later claimed that nearly 20 large cargo ships passed within sight over the following months. He waved, screamed, and once tried to signal with fire. None of them stopped. He kept himself sane, by his own account, through invented routines, imagined walks, one-sided conversations with family members thousands of miles away, and rigid daily routines that gave structure to days with no visible beginning or end. On January 30th, 2014, 438 days after he left Costa Azul, Alvarenga spotted birds, then land. He cut away the buoys tied to the boat, dove into the water, and let the current carry him onto the beach at Tile Islet, part of Ebon Atoll, after an estimated journey of roughly 6,700 miles. Emi Libok Meadow and her husband, Russell Laikidrick, were the ones who found him. Unable to understand a word of Spanish, they fed him and gave him shelter. The next day, Russell sailed to the main settlement to alert the mayor. Police and a nurse were sent out to bring him in. He was found with matted, shrub-like hair, a wild beard, multiple old scars, and wrists so thin they looked breakable. But he was not the gaunt, skeletal figure many people expected. His face looked puffy, while his ankles and legs were visibly swollen. That appearance may have reflected malnutrition, fluid imbalance, and the physical effects of prolonged deprivation rather than good health. To observers who expected a walking skeleton, however, it looked suspicious, and that detail, more than anything else, helped set off the doubts that would follow him for years. The United States ambassador to the Marshall Islands at the time, Tom Armbruster, who speaks Spanish, met with him directly. His reaction captured the split reaction that would follow. It's hard for me to imagine someone surviving 13 months at sea, but it's also hard to imagine how someone might arrive on Ebon out of the blue. Certainly this guy has had an ordeal. Others were far less generous. Ji Bing, the Marshall Islands acting Secretary of Foreign Affairs, told the Associated Press plainly, It does sound like an incredible story, and I'm not sure if I believe his story. When we saw him, he was not really thin compared to other survivors in the past. I may have some doubts. The island's police commissioner, George Lanwy, put it even more bluntly to reporters. It's hard to buy. Even Cesar Castillo, the owner of the boat Alvarenga had been fishing from, raised a specific and pointed question. How does a man go 7 months without developing scurvy, let alone 13 or 14? Journalists also noticed something else, an eerie echo. Back in 2006, 3 Mexican fishermen, named Lucio Rendon, Salvador Ordóñez, and Jesus Eduardo Vidaña, had drifted for roughly 9 months and also washed up in the Marshall Islands. The similarity was enough to make some reporters wonder if Alvarenga's story had simply borrowed the shape of a real one. Alvarenga's own answers didn't help matters at first. He gave conflicting dates for when he'd departed, at times saying mid-December rather than mid-November, a difference that shifted his total time at sea from around 14 months down to 13. He struggled with basic questions in the disoriented state he was in, and one translator working with him described him at the time as loopy and invisible pain. None of that proved he was lying, but none of it made the skeptics go away either. The strongest answer to those doubts came from oceanographers and survival specialists who examined whether his story was physically possible. At the University of Hawaii, oceanographers Nikolai Maximenko and John Hafner used an ocean drift model originally developed from tracked drifter data and later applied to debris from Japan's 2011 tsunami. They released 16 simulated drifters from waters off Mexico and found that their paths moved west toward the Marshall Islands, passing within roughly 120 miles of Ebon Atoll. Their conclusion was limited but important. Alvarenga's claimed route and general time frame were consistent with the winds and currents operating across the Pacific. Eric Van Sibyl, an oceanographer at the University of New South Wales, backed that up independently, telling the Associated Press that a crossing like this would typically take between 18 months and 2 years depending on wind and current, though 13 months was entirely possible under the right conditions. The scurvy question also had a plausible medical answer. Dr. Claude Piantadosi, a physiologist at Duke University, pointed out that unlike humans, birds and turtles produce their own vitamin C. Eating their raw meat, and especially their livers, could have supplied enough vitamin C to explain why Alvarenga did not develop obvious scurvy, even over more than a year. Survival experts largely agreed the account held together. A former U.S. Navy diver and marine survival trainer named Terry Crownover called the ordeal entirely believable. A survival instructor in Australia named Nick Vrumans explained that a drifting boat naturally becomes its own small ecosystem in tropical water, drawing fish underneath it and birds onto it, exactly as Alvarenga described. Stephen Callahan, who had himself survived 76 days adrift in the Atlantic in 1982, spoke publicly in Alvarenga's defense, noting that castaways are almost always accused of lying, simply because what they went through sounds impossible to people who haven't been through it. In April of 2014, at a press conference organized by an American law firm representing him, an investigator named Danilo Barrera announced that Alvarenga had taken and passed a polygraph test, and that his account had been verified as consistent with reality. It's worth being honest about what that actually means. Polygraph tests are not considered scientifically reliable by most researchers who study them, and a passed polygraph is closer to theater than proof. It made headlines. It did not settle anything. Jonathan Franklin, the journalist who would go on to spend years investigating the case and eventually write a full-length book about it, arrived skeptical himself. He interviewed colleagues, search and rescue officials, doctors, the islanders who found him, and outside experts ranging from the Coast Guard to Navy SEALs to people who had made their own long solo ocean crossings. After all of it, his conclusion was that Alvarenga's account of daily survival at sea matched what those experts would expect from someone who had actually lived through it. Even after the main outline of his story was corroborated, several details remained inconsistent across early reports. Alvarenga initially gave confused or conflicting departure dates, at times placing the trip in December rather than November. Later reporting, along with accounts from Costa Azul and the missing person timeline, established November 17, 2012, as the generally accepted departure date, producing the now standard total of 438 days. Estimates of the distance vary as well, partly because some sources measure the straight-line distance, while others estimate the much longer path taken by the currents, putting the figure at an estimated 6,700 miles. The timing of Córdoba's death also changed between Alvarenga's first fragmented statements and his later interviews. Those inconsistencies do not disprove the journey, but they mean some of its most dramatic details still depend heavily on Alvarenga's memory. Alvarenga's health worsened rather than improved in the days after his rescue. Doctors in Majuro, the Marshall Islands capital, put him on an intravenous drip for dehydration and found signs of anemia, along with concern about possible liver parasites from the raw meat he'd survived on. After 11 days, he was cleared to fly home, and Marshall Islands President Christopher Loeck personally saw him off with a traditional garland at the airport. He arrived back in El Salvador on February 11, 2014, to more than 100 journalists waiting at the airport. He was wheeled out in a chair, handed a microphone, and for a long moment said nothing at all, simply covering his face with his hands. His mother, Maria Julia, who had not seen him in 8 years, and his daughter Fatima, who barely remembered him, were waiting for him back in Garita Palmera, with a room that had been kept ready and a plate of pupusas. The physical recovery came faster than the psychological one. Doctors in El Salvador described a man who could not stand to hear the ocean discussed, who struggled with insomnia, and who needed constant company. One of his physicians, Dr. Freddy Cermeño, put it this way: "He does not want to hear about the ocean. His symptoms are truly post-traumatic." He kept the promise he'd made to Córdoba, eventually traveling to Mexico to visit Córdoba's mother in person and tell her what her son had asked him to pass along. His return to land brought 2 separate legal battles. In January of 2015, Alvarenga's own former lawyer and childhood friend, a man named Benedicto Perlera, sued him for $1 million over a contract dispute after Alvarenga switched representation to an American law firm. Perlera would later go on to represent Córdoba's family as well. Then, in December of 2015, shortly after Franklin's book was published, Córdoba's family filed their own lawsuit against Alvarenga, also seeking $1 million, alleging that he had eaten Córdoba's body rather than returning it to the sea as he claimed. Alvarenga's lawyer at the time called the suit an attempt to pressure him over the book's royalties, and pointed out that the book had not made Alvarenga wealthy. Alvarenga has always denied the accusation, and has consistently pointed to the promise Córdoba asked him to make before he died. Córdoba's own mother had said, back in February of 2014, before any lawsuit existed, "I want it understood that I am not blaming this person Alvarenga, nor am I declaring him guilty of anything. I could find no widely reported verdict or settlement in the case." In the accessible public reporting, the accusation was announced, denied by Alvarenga, and then largely disappeared from view. By early 2016, Alvarenga was reportedly living once again in El Salvador. He had stopped drinking, was attending church regularly, and still could not bring himself to enter the ocean. A therapist was encouraging him to face that fear, but the water remained tied to everything he had lost. He later described the sleepless nights that followed him home. "There are still nights when I can't sleep. The ocean keeps haunting me." Whether every detail of his account happened exactly as he remembered it may never be known. There was no logbook, no GPS record, and no surviving witness from the boat. But the journey itself was real. He left the coast of Mexico, disappeared into the Pacific, and more than a year later emerged alive on an island thousands of miles away. The currents make the route plausible, the available food makes survival physically possible, and the people who examined his account agreed on at least one thing: whatever happened aboard that boat, José Salvador Alvarenga had endured an extraordinary ordeal. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. Hopefully, I'll see you in the next one.